Episode 26, Will O'Connor. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. On today's episode, I speak with Dr. Will O'Connor, PhD. Now, in this episode, Will and I discuss a recent paper that Will and his group had just recently published, and this turned into be a great chat, not even about just carbohydrate restriction, but we talked about other kind of things in the end surrounding different types of stressors and training and whatnot. But I really enjoyed this conversation because in talking to Will, I could see that he didn't really have a side for carbohydrate restriction. He wasn't a zealot pushing carbohydrate restriction and saying it's applicable for everyone. And also he was very open and quite objective in stating carbs is the way for performance, no doubt. But also we shouldn't, just because carbs are the way for performance, it doesn't mean that we should not try and investigate what are the underlying mechanisms taking place when we're restricting carbohydrates. Is there a way to modify that to make anything maybe beneficial for an individual, whether it's a recreational athlete or maybe a professional athlete? What is to be gained there? So I really enjoyed, talking to someone that wasn't, kind of on really pushing either side. We'll discuss many times where he's like, this is just, this is the case, this is how it is, carbs are the way for this, scenario or whatever. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. And I that's one of the reasons why, is because I don't lie on either side of the table when it comes to carbohydrate restriction. I understand it as a stressor. I've done ketogenic diets, I've done low carb diets, I've done high carb diets, I've done everything in between. I see everything as just kind of a modality and try to understand to the best of my ability what are the gaps that are going to needed to be filled. Like I discussed briefly in this episode with carbohydrate restriction, what's going on with bone metabolism, bone resorption, bone growth, certain markers like CTX and osteocalcin and whatnot, and the implications for bone mineral density loss. That's the thing, is like when we're talking about things, I think we should try and investigate these things to the utmost degree and try to understand them to the best of our ability, so we can inform ourselves why it may or may not be appropriate for certain individuals or yourself. Thinking about what is the person's individual response to that. How does it affect their sleep? How does it affect their stress? How does it affect their neurochemical balance, whether it's glutamate, GABA, all these different things. There's, also things to take in consideration about how are they handling the training volume on top of this other stressor of carbohydrate restriction. So there's a lot of things to take in consideration when talking about carbohydrate restriction. And I think, this is kind of a good conversation to hear, where are the benefits that we're seeing in the research? Are they for recreational athletes? Are they for professional athletes? Also, kind of what are the drawbacks of that? The whole thing's talking about bone density and these things, and what you should try to be considerate of when or if you were to engage in something like this. And I think realistically, at the end of the day, the more knowledge you have and the more experience you have, the kind of wider your view tends to get. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. It was great to have Will on and talk all things carbohydrate restriction and how he's, kind of approached it in the past and where he's at kind of now with it and how he views it now compared to before. So if you want to find Will, I'll leave links to him in the show notes. Also, Will has been working on this essentially endurance mentorship program. Like it's a course, it's a long 6-month course that kind of walks you through and exposes you to, how to think as an individual coaching yourself in the sport of running. So this I think is a super cool concept. Like I've seen it in other fields, but I think it's absolutely genius because I've never seen this really applied to endurance sports. So I'll leave the links to that in the show notes, which will keep updated as he makes progression on releasing that. Also, I'll leave the links to his website and his Instagram and all that stuff to find him there. So hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and and please keep in mind that we're trying to be objective here and see both sides of the coin. So don't run away at this podcast and think that either one of us is pushing low carb or high carb, or any type of carb or any type of diet. We're just talking about a subject. So hopefully you guys enjoy. Thanks. All right, Will. So I reached out to you, and it was luckily right at a time where you had something coming out, which you guys just recently published a paper on, chronic carbohydrate restriction and how that affects endurance capacity in men and women, which is, this has been a hot topic over the years, obviously, and it's kind of resurfaced. And, there's a lot of different directions that people try to take this in, whether it's, mRNA signaling and mitochondria and like, oh, is there adaptations we can get there? Or, overall just substrate utilization, talking about, like what you guys are talking about. But there were some things that you kind of pulled out too in your paper that I thought were kind of unique. Um, so maybe kind of just give us a brief introduction of, how did you get to this point where you're interested in looking at this? Where are you now? Yeah. So
Sweet. Well, yeah, thanks for reaching out. It was good timing. Uh,
yeah.
so yeah, low carb, right? Ketosis, paleo, like it's gone through its iterations of terminology, and it's all
Hmm.
kind of centered around the same thing of carbohydrate restriction.
Hmm.
And yeah, my journey into low carb starts a while back with Tim Noakes. I'm sure have
Yeah.
you
Oh
heard
yeah.
of the South African kind of
Oh yeah. Thick rice.
yeah, he's got the book Challenging Beliefs, and it's really his kind of style of he introduced that whole drink to thirst with Waterlogged, his book.
Mhm.
But anyway, at the time, so this must have been around 2012, I guess, he was very vocal on Twitter about this low carbohydrate situation. And one of the guys during my honors he was a power lifter, and he was doing a ketogenic, like a cyclic,
Mhm.
the anabolic diet. Oh, I can't remember who wrote that, but it was pretty well known, circulated like PDF that people were putting around in the strength and conditioning circles.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, he was studying with me, and I thought that's outrageous. I'm an endurance athlete, and fat's bad. It's just not, it's not good. You need to eliminate fat from your diet so that you can burn your whatever body fat you have, and then not generate any more. It
Mhm.
was kind of despite definitely knowing better from my time as doing an undergrad in biochemistry. I guess I wasn't open to the idea that fat could be good,
Mhm.
and so he would be drinking cream and eating cheese, and I was like, that just can't be good. It can't be. And I remember our teacher, who ended up becoming my PhD supervisor, he said, "Why not?" And because I said, "Steve, can you tell this guy like he can't just drink cream? It's outrageous." And he goes, "Why not?" And then I remember him challenging me on why, like how fat could be utilized at a greater rate, and you could spare carbohydrate and stuff. And I still was like, nah, right? Like you
Mhm.
just can't. You have to eliminate fat, because otherwise you'll store too much of it, and you'll gain body fat.
Mhm.
And that's the last thing I want. So I was just so strict at eliminating fat from my diet. Like I was cutting the fat off bacon. I was just super carb, like, probably 70-80% of my diet was carbohydrate with the rest protein. And then obviously I would have had some fat. But after that year of my honors, I went into doing trying to be a professional triathlete, like middle, like half Ironman kind of stuff. So I moved to Australia with some guys, and I went about overtraining myself. And
Mm,
part of whatever happened with me metabolically,
mm,
hormonally, whether it was diet based or like the training, the overtraining, I was putting on a lot of body fat, like quite a lot.
yeah,
And I was just really confused as to how I could train so much, like 30 hours a week, without having a car. So I was also commuting everywhere, and I was still gaining body fat. I was like, this just doesn't make sense. And then so stumbled across Tim Noakes' stuff, and I thought, well, I mean, I might as well try it. I mean, scientifically, it makes sense.
mm,
And so, yeah, I went about restricting carbohydrate from my diet, and it was shocking, the change. Like fat was like falling off of my body. I
mm,
thought, what is this? How is this working? I I can't really comprehend the rate of change. And then yeah, that led me into, like, during that year, I was like, I don't want to be a professional athlete. This is way too much pressure and stress, and I enjoy coaching and researching. So yeah, went into doing my PhD, and I was like, I need to research this topic. This is the topic. There just has to be more to this, and I can see some gaps in the in the research, that that I think I could fill. And so that's the kind of long-winded story of where I landed on wanting to know more about carbohydrate restriction.
mm. That's interesting. And I think that is a probably an angle a lot of people might see, but not have the like. It's one of the things I've heard. Like, for example, I hear a lot of knocks on some of the studies that have come out previously. Like, what I mean, it starts all at the faster study, and it even starts before that. Realistically, if you look at some of the research done before that, um, but realistically, these things could probably be investigated fairly easily. Now, obviously, when we're talking about diet, when we're talking about training, these are very hard, variables to control tightly. But regardless, the actual means of getting them done, um, it's relatively easy in terms of research. Like there's a lot of logistical solving that goes into it. But, you know, for all the excuses I hear and why, these things don't work, I feel like instead of just blanketly slating something that we don't fully understand yet, we should really just be digging deeper to understand what's going on, because just there's so much going on when you're changing someone's diet. It's just, and people want to say, oh yeah, it's just one thing. But can you kind of talk about what was the things in the research that you saw that you felt were missing? Like what were some of the gaps? Because I feel like I have a few stuck in my head, but what were some of the things that you're like, I don't think that's fully parsed out yet, or what are some of the questions you want to answer?
The the big ones were the combination of long-term adaptation and an ultra endurance test.
Yeah.
So what I saw was 7-day adaptation cycles, which
Hmm.
isn't an adaptation cycle for any kind of physiological, like, intervention.
Hmm.
So restricting carbohydrate for 7 days, and then the test would be like a 20-minute all-out time trial, or a 5K run, 3,000-meter track run. So these, super, high anaerobic and contribution to performance-based, like, tests. Then, if they did do a longer term adaptation, so we're starting to get into 14 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or longer, again, they're doing these, kind of, they might test metabolically, but they didn't test performance. And if they did, again, it was, like, if they tried to do a long term one, it might have been a 2-hour fixed intensity ride with a like Wingate or like a 1 minute or 5 minute all out at the end of that.
Hmm.
And so that was some of this. So I just couldn't see the ideal scenario of
Yeah.
saying, look, so what I did with my study, I said, all right, here we go. We've got 4 weeks of adaptation, both diets, randomized crossover. So if you came in, I got you, whatever, you're either low carb or high carb first, you got a washout period, and then your high carb, low carb, whatever alternative second. And then you're doing a performance test that's the work equivalent to a 5-hour time trial at 55% of your VO2 max.
Hmm.
So, you know, prior to you coming in, we tested your VO2 max and whatever 55% of the power was. So if you're on the bike, 55% might have been 150 watts. So if you rode at 150 watts for 5 hours, it would equate to, let's just say, 3,600 kilojoules.
Yeah.
So we kind of said on the indoor bike, that ergometer, we could measure energy output. So we just said, you've got, go,
Mm.
go and do your best yeah, to execute this amount of energy, which is it was pretty much equivalent to 100 and kind of 60K, 140 kilometer, so about 100-mile like time trial.
Mhm.
Uh, and during that, I also gave carbohydrate, so as you would in a race, and I also did a carbohydrate loading
Mm.
protocol. So the day before, you had carbohydrates
Mm.
on both diets. So what I wanted to create was, the ideal scenario of what would you do in the real world? What are athletes doing in the real world?
Mhm.
And what is going to give us the best information to show that you, yeah, you are going to perform better, or you're not, or this diet is going to have an effect on your performance.
Mm.
And then alongside the performance measures, we can take blood samples, we can measure respiratory rate and the carbohydrate fat utilization,
Mhm.
body mass, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
what do you think? What do you think in your reading of the research and just being in the field, like
well,
gaps?
I don't, you know, I'm one of those people that I have a lot of thoughts on things, but I don't have a lot of opinions. Because I see how much, you know, just like we thought we knew this. Oh, we thought we knew this a bit, whether it's lifting, whether it's running, cycling, anything we thought we understood. And, 20 years later, looking at the research that's coming out now, I see there's some things that are stable, right? We know some things fairly well. But with carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, there's some things that I know that's solid and what I see out there. But there's a lot that's unknown. And basically my unknowns are, one, for example, what is the difference between 16 weeks of adaptation and 2 years of adaptation? You know what I mean? What's the difference there? What does that look like? What does that look like in peak power output? What does that look like in, training volume, the ability to tolerate training volume? Um, and for example, like something that you tested in your study, right? Body composition. Like you guys use bioelectrical impedance. Like there's things surrounding bone density that I have a big interest in. I've read some papers from Luis talking about that, with osteocalcin, and procollagen type 1 terminal propeptide, like those markers, CDX, like the C terminal telopeptide. Some of those markers around bone density, those interest me because I see a lot of people. And you didn't test ketogenic diets. Let's clarify this for
I did
folks.
in
Yeah,
another study, but yeah,
yeah. This study was 2 grams or less of carbohydrates per kg, and for
yeah,
the
per
low
day, yeah.
carbohydrate per day, and the high carbohydrate was 5 grams per kg, per day or above for the moderate carbohydrate. But you know just like anything, for example, if we're on a specific diet and we're changing macronutrients aggressively or dramatically, what are things that would support in that? You know, what are the effects on the neurotransmitters? What are the effects on, you know, GABA and these different things? Anyways, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but there's a lot of things I don't know. I still think, like I was talking about this with Mike T. Nelson the other day. I think ultra endurance cycling um, is probably the big application for some of this low carb, whether it's, you know, some of these, you know, 24 hours, you know, some of these things, even getting into Ironman, there's good territory. And under that, I just don't know, right? I don't know because there's questions around. I don't know. Have you guys looked into much about you know, periodization? About periodization, like
Like
carbohydrate
dietary
periodization?
periodization.
Yeah,
Yeah,
carbohydrate.
I
Yeah.
think, and that was I can't remember if it's in the like key takeaways or practical applications of this paper, but yeah, that's it. I think that's one of the big applications of low carb. And
Mm,
I was listening to a podcast with one of the head scientists of one of the sports scientists of one of the pro cycling teams,
mm,
and this is a few years back, and he was saying, yeah, we uh, ketosis, ketogenic, like exogenous ketone supplements.
mm.
These are all tools we can use in our toolbox,
Yeah.
and I think that's what the research is showing. Where like it's what I showed, especially in the men, where you're not decreasing performance. That was the main
Yeah.
takeaway of my study. Like no one decreased performance,
Yeah.
no one. And women in particular improved significantly. Men stayed very similar.
Yeah.
And we, as normal, you have responders and non-responders. And my sample size was 13, so 5 women, 8 men. Not huge, but you're not going to get huge, and unless
Yeah.
someone's going to fund it massively.
Yeah.
It's still a massive undertaking to have 13 people through 8 weeks of controlled diet, plus pre
Yeah.
and post testing and all of the logistics that go around that controlled training. Um, but if there's a difference to be seen, you'd see it, right?
Mhm.
Like that's what we're trying to find, and we didn't see it either way. So we're not seeing that a low carbohydrate diet is drastically reducing your performance, and we're not really seeing that anywhere across the board. Like if you were a 1500-meter runner and you got to do a lot of, yeah, very highly anaerobic like session, like speed work, and
Yeah.
like the nature of the muscular contractions that you're doing do require a lot of metabolic power. Just through the nature of not having carbohydrate present, you're going to downregulate a lot of those factors, like
Yeah.
in glycolysis, just through self-preservation.
Yeah.
So why would you try and reduce carbohydrate? But then if you're coming off of your season and you're entering into your base phase, you're rebuilding.
Mm.
Some of these athletes might have a domestic season that they might do some road racing or cross countries over 10 kilometers, 6 miles or so. So yeah, they might want to get their weight back under control, their body composition, so they can use a low carbohydrate approach
Yeah.
to implement that. But in season, it's ridiculous. There's no way.
Yeah.
But I think like what I've seen over the years is kind of this is like a merger of the two fields of
Mhm.
or like polarized opinions of like you have to be high carb, like some of these like 10 grams, 11 grams kg
Pre-diabetic.
per day, like it's like
Yeah.
holy moly. I've tried those like loading protocols and they're aggressive. You feel bloated and you
Yeah.
store a lot of water.
Yeah.
You got to do them properly, and then to the extent where yeah, I like when I was getting super into like ketosis, having a fear of carbohydrate,
Mhm.
right? And then like trying to yeah be super restrictive and thinking that any carbohydrate was going to make me fat or like knock me out of ketosis and have all these issues,
Yeah.
and it'll ruin my metabolic flexibility. And now, like, I seem to ride in probably still more to the lower carb side, but definitely don't have that fear of carbohydrate. And the science is unequivocal that carbohydrates are necessary for optimal performance,
Yeah.
right? Like, you can't ignore that. Like, you need carbohydrate if you want to perform optimally, because you can't just rely on one fuel source. Like, it'd
Yeah.
be like running your car without oil, unless you have an
Yeah.
electric car, I guess. But like, yeah, you
Yeah.
can have your unleaded fuel or diesel or whatever, but if you're not putting oil in, isn't it, the whole system's not going to work.
Yeah.
Um, so
No, I'm glad you went through that, because as soon as you start talking about carbohydrate restriction research, I feel like a lot of people just automatically turn a switch on in their head and they're like, "Oh, this guy's a low carber." Right? Like, but if you actually listen to what a lot of low carb people are saying, it's not anything crazy. Like, there is some people, right? There's people on
totally,
both sides,
yeah, yeah.
but a lot of people are just saying, "Hey, it's it's the same if we were to talk about like heat training. Imagine if we'd just discovered heat training and now people are like, oh, heat training every day, all day. It's going to make you better. Right. This is how I look at things. And like people be like, oh, you're an idiot if you think you're going to get better. It's training in the blistering, sweltering heat every day. And you're like, no, look at these adaptations, the signaling, look at all this. And it's like, you get the extremes rather than saying, oh, it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox. Um, and that's what I see a lot of people. I don't see a lot of well-educated people out there really saying like, hey, you need, like, this is on race day, you got to be slamming back fat bombs, and unless it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
ultra marathoners or something for GI distress, maybe they're steering away from carbs or something. But yeah, I think there's some reasonable ground here. So like even in your study, you guys really promoted the idea as like, hey, there's definitely what we're seeing is somewhat of a sex variance here between metabolic flexibility, right? Between male and females. It seems that females have a little bit of a more narrow range, and showing by their RER values and stuff like that, saying, hey, they're a little bit less metabolically flexible here. So what kind of implications does that have for what we're talking about as using this as a tool? That's the type of stuff. Like, if we didn't, if we don't research this stuff, it's going to be hard to understand how to apply any tools in the future, regardless if we're talking about just carbohydrate restriction. Anyways, so realistically, like in your study, what you guys found is, there was body composition, recomposition for men on both diets, right? On moderate
Yeah.
and low carb, and for the females, you found that the low carbohydrate seemed to cause recomposition, essentially losing fat mass, and higher carbohydrate had increased fat mass. But what are some of the other things that you found in there that were kind of unique and been like, hey, this has really informed me on like how I'm going to investigate this in the future or think about this in the future? What were some other things that you?
Uh, One of the 5 women actually liked the diet, and part of that reduction in body fat mass or improvement in body composition could be attributed to reduction in like overall caloric intake.
Mhm.
Because yeah, was there any men who didn't like it? I can't remember off the top of my head, but the men were into it.
Mhm.
Bacon, eggs, like, let's go, like,
Yeah, yeah,
cream in my oats, like,
yeah.
we're all good here. And then the women, for whatever reason, it just did not, that fatty based diet, it didn't agree with the woman of my study.
Mhm.
So yeah, w- what's causing that? Like, is that uh, a nature or nurture thing? Like, is that
Mhm.
innate, that there's something that doesn't agree with them to match their whatever genetic profile, metabolic profile?
Mhm.
But so that was a big one, really. That the woman despite like significantly improving their performance, all were like, "No, I'm not going to do that." There's
Mhm.
there's no, like, it was it wasn't very pleasant for 4 weeks.
Mhm.
Whereas, and this is something we picked up a lot during in our lab. We had a number of PhD students at the same time, and there's all these different things like polyphenols and nitrites, like that supplementation. Where you're like, oh, yes, there's potentially an improvement in performance here, but
Mhm.
it's such a rigmarole. I could sleep better the night before the event.
Mhm.
Like there's so
Mhm.
many things. How aggressive do we want to go with some of the stuff where, um, yeah, to chase 10 watts for the majority of people, like, is it really going to be, if you're not enjoying it, if it is a challenge to you, to try and implement whatever things the science has brought up and you've read about. um but yeah, so then, yeah, with that metabolic flexibility, that was something that we noticed with the woman, was there's a potential that they don't have the large bandwidth that males do to either burn fat or carbohydrate at the peak rates.
Wow.
So their peak rates are, I can't remember, five, yeah, point, like, I can't, yeah, half a gram less per hour, or a gram. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they didn't have
Mhm.
those capacities where you can, like, when I'm talking metabolic flexibility, I'm saying, yeah, Matt would like bring you in. I'm going to eliminate carbohydrate from your diet. And you're like, I'm all
Mhm.
good here. I can't, obviously, I can't do a 2 minute, peak output.
Mhm.
Or no, you probably could, but
Mhm.
5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe not. Uh, so that's just like, that's science, that's metabolic capacity.
Yeah.
But then, similarly, I could feed you carbohydrates, load you up, and again, you're all good for everything.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas when you're metabolically inflexible, which is tendency for most endurance athletes, which is my main focus, you remove carbohydrate from their diet and their performance is down 40%.
Yeah.
And that's just on like a 1 hour aerobic general run, ride, swim, or whatever. They have no flexibility to be able to utilize fat as a fuel.
Yeah.
And so the capacity to improve their signaling, you know, beta oxidation pathways, the whole, like, the that whole AMP, the whole process, the whole metabolic process is massive.
Yeah.
But is that going to improve your performance? Probably not, because for my cohort anyway, highly trained endurance athletes, you have already kind of elicited the the optimal, not necessarily optimal metabolic flexibility, but a metabolic flexibility and metabolic capacity that is good enough
Yeah.
for what you do. So just through the nature of being a highly trained athlete, you go out and you do a ride without breakfast. You do a fasted training session just because it happens on times. You go out and you do, if you're doing a 3 hour ride, you're doing a run of 20 kilometers or 2 hours or something, you run out of food, you forget. And so by the nature of that, you're enforcing like these increased fat, like, utilization, and increasing the pathway and the stimulus and the subsequent recovery from those sessions. And so while you haven't specifically implemented a protocol or strategy to try and improve your metabolic flexibility, just through the nature of training week in, week out, like, it happens,
Yeah.
and it happens to a state that's good enough for you to be able to perform. But caveat of that is you cannot miss a beat with your carbohydrate supplementation,
Yeah.
because your reliance is so much greater than someone who is utilizing fat 30% more than you are. So while you're able to meet your energetic requirements for a 3 hour run, 5 hour ride, 10 hour ultra marathon, by not supplementing with carbohydrate, you're running the risk that your performance will have to decrease when that, if blood sugar does drop, or there becomes a competing metabolic environment between the brain and the body, or the extremities, or the muscles. So
Yeah, there's a couple things that you mentioned there, like even when talking about, yeah, the female really enjoyed the diet and just talking about, the nature nurture around fat, genetics. One thing is, you know, how does a person perceive, this thing is going to be intervening with them? And also, when we're talking about recreational athletes, there has been some literature to show like, hey, this can be actually quite beneficial for recreational athletes or low level, age groupers kind of thing, right? Improving their ability to utilize fat and it's a bigger part of the factor for people in the beginning for performance, right? Because that profile hasn't really developed well yet.
yeah, you're
Yeah,
exactly right. And this
yeah,
is we found this a lot through a lot of different research projects is like the further down that training spectrum you are, or
yeah,
say even that VO2 max scale, the greater a lot of these interventions are going to have, like the nitrites,
yeah,
polyphenols, like strength training, plyometrics.
yeah,
Like, so what is that? Is that an elite athlete has already self-selected themselves to the ideal kind of training style, and then you implement plyometrics, and it's like, well, I'm already tendon stiffness is good enough,
yeah,
and all of that to get, and so I'm already up here,
mhm,
and I got here through whatever means, and then but you get someone earlier on in the spectrum, you go plyometrics, and you're like, whoa, I hadn't even established my uh, full potential of training, let alone like trialing the trial and error that goes with these different styles. Like, yeah, I've trained for the last decade quite intensively, I guess, for endurance sports. And I've tried so many things, and each of them has worked and not worked at different
yeah,
times. Like just really, really intense, high intensity training, low volume, like high quality, and then it doesn't work.
yeah,
And then, and that's going back to your like question or statement about periodization,
yeah,
and, and why that's so important. I'm sure you've had similar experiences over your
yeah, yeah. Because
career.
I think most people when they start low carb, they go all in, right? They whether they go,
It's the nature of the people probably listening right now.
it
Like, and you're
is,
like,
yes,
don't half-ass it. Like, I don't even
yeah,
want to hear that there's like two sides to the story. Like, just tell
yeah,
me,
yeah,
like, I'm
yeah,
hunting for this info to as like a confirmation bias that I need to do this,
yeah,
that I can eat steak for breakfast.
yeah. And it's just like you're saying, like there's nothing that when you push to extremes, like whether let's talk about like strength training for performance, right? Like there's echoes of what you said there. Like for example, like some crazy NBA basketball player comes into the strength room and this strength and conditioning coach thinks like, oh, I'm going to make him a better athlete by getting him to squat 400 pounds. Like, you know what I mean? Like they have this idea that they think that their intervention is going to make a huge change. And it's like, they're really maxed out at where they're at already. So like anything you do, if anything happens, a lot of times you can just break people. So for people to understand, like when we're talking about improving performance, well, if we look at kind of like we're talking about the lower spectrum, um, you have to take in what we're seeing there. And when talking about periodization, one of the things I've found is like you said, yeah, you miss a fueling station, you miss an aid station, or you get a little bit off route, or whatever it is. A leg takes you a little bit too long. We've all been there. Something happens, and not only that, just your resilience to stress. You go out for a training run, you get lost, whatever it is, or you go out for too
Yeah,
long. You're with your friends, you burn through a little bit too quick. One thing I do notice is people that are too far on the side of being high carb, obviously their metabolic flexibility is lower, and one thing I see is it's almost like they're less resilient. Like because I felt that. I'm talking from personal experience too, and I've seen it in other people as well, where it's like this insulin management, these insulin excursions, and you're like trying to stay on top of it. You're trying to stay, because when you go high carb, that's the game. And you have to be on point. And something that me and Mike were talking about, was we're talking about a whole bunch of things: physiological flexibility and metabolic flexibility. But part of that is being, putting your body under stress in different ways. And when you're restricting carbohydrates, we know that that is a different form of stress, and you're not going to do that at a time where you've already had a huge stress load. But when you're putting on that stress, there's generally going to be some type of positive adaptation to be yielded if you're not already maxed out, right? I don't know. How do you look
Yeah,
at
and if
it?
you're recovering.
Yeah, and you're recovering, right? Like, you're not overtrained, you're not overloaded, you're being appropriate with the stimulus. That's all I look at it as. It's no different than going in a sauna, no different than going in an ice bath, no different than, it's just another type of stimulus, and it's going to provide something different if you're not maxed out. Um, how do you look at it? Like, how do you kind of view the whole periodization landscape? Because that's something I'm interested in hearing, is like, because we talk about, periodization in the week, periodization in the training program, periodization from just, the last cycle before the race, and then the race, your high carb, right? Like, how do you look at some of these different periodization schemes? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Or do you mean in relation to diet or
Yeah,
overall as like
diet.
a
Yeah, low
coach?
carb.
And
Yeah.
um, yeah, we definitely have the athletes that respond better to the diet.
Hmm.
I don't know. Is it a response or is it um, a a mental openness
Hmm.
to live a certain way? Because like you get those people, it's a lifestyle, it's not a diet. Don't call it a diet.
No,
Well,
yeah.
it's yeah, it is kind of both. It's
Hmm.
definitely a diet because you're restricting the food that you eat in a certain way. Uh, but it's just not going to work for some people
Yeah,
as well. So there's no
for sure.
point forcing that. And then the other people, where someone like myself, I'm going to be pretty intense. Okay, some of the
Yeah.
listeners are going to go all in,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
you really need to cyclic the control the periodization of the diet coming into. So yeah, base fat aerobic dominant phase. So if let's say it's a marathoner, it's half Ironman, Ironman, ultra marathon.
Yeah.
These sports that are going to typically take people over 3 hours,
Yeah.
uh, and for that the intensity, relative intensity is low, especially if you're taking over 3 hours for a marathon. Then you're probably operating 80-85% VO2 max, uh, which in the scheme of things is right around the very upper limit of maximal fat oxidation if you were well adapted. So,
Yeah.
so there's a means and or justification to really force that adaptation
Mhm.
so that you can, improve fat oxidation to the maximal capacity. Um, but yeah, you need to be very consistent with it, and you need to not be doing um, uh, short distance or like anything that's going to require you to perform like a lot of really high intensity, uh, like VO2 type, VO2 max type
Mhm.
training sessions. Because what I've seen is the the recovery side of things. So whatever's happening in terms of the metabolic stress that's going on to try and operate at these really anaerobic, metabolically anaerobic outputs, is really stressful to recover when you're not also replenishing carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh well, you could weekly periodize your carbohydrates to go in line with your hardest sessions, but it starts to become intense.
Mhm.
like like it starts to become more of um, like programming conundrum and headache than the actual training itself. And so
Yeah.
now for the majority of people I work with, that they're busy professional, like working professionals, not professional athletes, they don't have the energy and the time to try and implement all that stuff. So it's easier to say, look, during this base phase, this like we're maintenance recovery from a big race coming into a big season. I want you like super hard on your restriction. Okay. So
Mhm.
2 grams is per kg per day is your upper limit. Let's really push it down as far as possible. Then we can roll into the next phase, which may include some like B races, C races. And what we'll do is we might cycle it, the diet. So the weekends, yeah, Friday through Sunday, go hard.
Mm.
Monday through Friday, you don't have the time to do 2-3 hour big sessions. You're doing 45, 60-minute sessions, and you're going to have enough carbohydrates through that, and maybe just make sure you have some post.
Mm.
Uh, but you're not training twice a day for an hour and a half, 2 hours. So
Yeah.
your actual energetic output is relatively low when you're comparing yourself to someone who's training 30 hours a week, and actually having 4 grams per kg per day could actually be low carb and could
Yeah.
still implement like a similar adaptation. And yeah, then who are you working with? If they're traveling a lot, like if you've traveled and trying to do low carb, it's a headache, man. It's
Yeah.
so hard.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does that answer your question? I mean,
No, it is. It just gives people a look of what you're talking about. And you did, preface like, hey, this doesn't work for everyone. It's the same thing with high altitude. There's non-responders to altitude, right? Depending on
definitely. Yeah.
genetics, right? And people would say, you're crazy to go and suffer up there, non-respond. Like, yeah, well, it's still being advised out there to improve performance. People don't shit on people that are altitude junkies, right? So it's just understanding the application of who's in front of you. What does their profile look like? What can they benefit? What are the demands of what they're doing? And, when we're talking about these ultra distances, I've seen some case studies. I've seen lots of stuff to show like, steadier pace, steadier, obviously glucose control, these things. Um, I definitely see it. And not only talking about just shorter, 3 hour, I'm talking about like even ultra marathon distance. When you're talking about GI distress, what is one of the number one causes of dropout for ultra marathons? It's GI distress, right? I'll never forget
Yeah.
the time.
There's a research came out 2018 maybe, or more recently,
Yeah,
that had that as the like. Yeah, I don't think it was for 100 kilometer. I think 100 mile
yeah.
was where GI was like the biggest limiter of performance.
And it's huge, right?
Uh,
And just shifting
yeah,
people a little bit back, even slightly, like anything we can get. And this is good. I'm glad to hear a little bit of a voice of reason here. Um, and
that's so. Yeah, and as you, because the majority of people in a 100 mile ultra marathon aren't the top of the field, because
exactly,
like
yeah,
just through the nature of the sport, it
the
doesn't
sport,
attract a huge number of top competitors.
yeah,
And so, yeah, the percentage of VO2 max, like the relative intensity you're operating at is so low. It's like
yeah,
you just need to find a nutritional strategy that like uh, has the lowest GI
distress,
disturbance possible. Yeah. Um,
yeah,
and because as long as you can maintain blood sugar, like blood glucose levels,
yeah,
you're going to be okay.
yeah,
Like, yeah, you'll find what works for you, as most people do when they're out on the trails or out on the roads or on the athletics track, whatever kind of ultra you're doing for hours. You'll know,
yeah,
potatoes work or chips at this time. But my biggest recommendation is to never overload on any one thing,
yeah,
because that's, you're already at a risk. But
yeah,
yeah, when you're trucking along at 50% VO2 max, like you there's theoretically, right, you could not eat
yeah,
for the entire duration. You could just drink, maintain hydration status, and
yeah,
you would be fine. Would you perform optimally? I don't know.
no, yeah,
And so uh yeah, there's these really cool studies when I was doing my research I was looking into, and they had glucose clamps, so ultra intravenous glucose clamp, so
okay,
intravenously feeding glucose to maintain, um like euglycemia. That's it, right? Where
Yeah.
it's just maintains blood glucose to an optimal standard between
Mm.
4 to 6 millimole, uh, and the performance still declined or fatigue and set at the same period. I think they were testing around, it must have been 65, 70%. I remember this is all off the top of my head, but they were all around 3 hour, like fixed time, do
Yeah.
as much power as you can, or if it was just time to exhaustion at 70%. But anyway, there's no difference. It's really interesting. And I thought, like, so then that adds in that psychological component of, like
Yeah.
the mouth rinse. So
Yeah. Yeah. The mouth
I
rinse.
was
Yeah.
involved in some heat-based mouth rinse stuff, and like you get a big psychological boost, like or dopamine or whatever kind of euphoric stimulant is being released just by swirling uh, fructose or a sugar sweetener.
Yeah.
And I think we actually had artificial sweetener um, in your mouth and then spitting it out. So you're not even digesting any of it, but they've shown like that improves performance. So yeah, like
Yeah.
eating would definitely help just through that, right?
There's
Just
so
just through
much
the
to that.
psychology of it.
Like when I think of, well, I'm actually going to have Mike McKnight on at some point. I was in contact with him, and he's done a couple 100 milers, completely fasted. Um,
Wow. Yeah.
and they were under 20 hours. I'm not sure on the terrain. I will get into that with him. Um, but I mean, like he just anecdotally, he talked about his recovery was obviously the best. And obviously, I think Mike said this too, is like he's not running the paces he would be running while he's fed, but he hasn't really tested the limit of that yet. I don't think, from what I've heard, anyways. So I will be interested to dig into that with him to hear all about his experiences and how he approached that and what was his reasoning behind some of the paces he was doing and all those things. But it just goes to show, like, there's a obviously there's a wide range of possibilities for all this stuff. So I'm really interested to see where it goes in the future. Um, because I just think there's so much left to be explored here, and to kind of negate some of the stuff that we're hearing out there, whether because we know now with electrolytes is actually important when you're when you're first coming onto some of these carbohydrate diets, and the amount of water you're shedding, and just little things as people go along to try and play with them, and you learn about your body, you learn about the process of what's going on. um, One of the things I will be interested to see is, um, you know, down the road, what are the kind of things that we're going to see with other portions? Because right now we're kind of stuck in this low carb, right, high carb, right, and low fat and high fat. But what are the other things about to shift the metabolic flexibility that we're not really taking into consideration? Right? Like, what about fasting? What about some of these other triggers of, loading some of these macronutrients at different times of the day? Because think about when we load carbohydrates at night only. Like we go out and engage in a full day of training, carbohydrate restriction, essentially, and then you periodize and put carbs back in your body. We still don't really fully know what's going on there yet. Like we understand there's actually some different signaling going on, and it seems to work similar to low carbohydrate, but not as extreme. But just manipulating certain variables like that, I think, even for body composition, all these things, I think we know some of that already. But there's just so many possibilities. What are some of the things that you're interested to see in the future, even just around diet? It doesn't even have to be about around low carb. It can be. But what are some of the things that you're interested in investigating in this kind of area?
Or probably the what you mentioned about the like carbohydrate timing
Hmm.
uh around there there's many ways to skin a cat. and so fasting is definitely one that's going to elicit like a really, well, I guess we can call it a positive metabolic adaptation, and fasted training. But then there's the implications that come with that, with recovery, and the genetic side of things would be super interesting if there was a genetic profile that did match a particular diet, which like evolutionarily would make sense just from where we established, like and that would based off of where we evolved, or your particular ancestors evolved from, and the diet that they were exposed to. So I mean, that's where the whole world's going in terms of research and associating, or coding or decoding the genetics and trying to associate that with particular kind of lifestyles. Yeah, I think finding that kind of sweet spot where we could easily get a similar adaptation to increase metabolic flexibility. Because there's one guy I was training with, he was, so what would he do? He would eat within 2 hours. He would only eat within a 2 hour window every day. I think it was like 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. And we were all like, "You're nuts." And he's like, "No, I've read it. I've read up." And he just kept getting better, right? And you're like, "Okay, so how could that work?" "Oh yeah, I could kind of see how that would work, but could you do it better?" Right? And are we already at better with what we've kind of science always follows kind of anecdotal implementation, like coaching strategies and stuff that we've seen and tried in the field. And I think the individual nature of diet and also training, and that needs to be researched more, which is the hardest thing. Like we can, like my study, we can do these things and go, look, it's worth trialing, like a low carbohydrate diet. Here you go, set yourself a 2 gram per kg per day restrictive limit, try and get as far below that as you can, and see how that works for you, because on average it's not going to reduce your performance, so it's well worth doing. So a lot of that, but then some of the stuff you were saying before, I'm thinking, like, if we have our kind of conspiracy hat on, like, who makes money off of fasting? But who makes money off of figuring out 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour during an endurance event is highly probable to improve performance at capacity that we thought 90 grams was the uppermost, and now it's like, oh, whatever, you can train yourself to go far beyond that. Everything carbohydrate based, you have to buy those carbohydrates from somewhere, from a source. Anything low carbohydrate based, well, no one's really making money really in our world of like exercise performance, sport and exercise science. So I think that has a big factor as to what research is going to get funded, versus what might be more beneficial to the whole body of research, and the lens at which people look through things. It's a hard one, because it's so restrictive. Like my study is so restrictive in what I'm able to do and then what I'm able to report versus, what you can anecdotally see with everyone. But then if you just report anecdotal reports, there's such big holes in them that people should really take them with big, thick grains of salt. But they're the people who are probably going to speak the loudest. And it's tough. Like this podcast is a great way to get podcasts just in general are really good ways to get the conversation going for people to try and, decipher what's going to work for them.
Yeah. And it just, gives people a little bit of a long, because I mean, I hear a lot of these arguments going on, and I can't even go on Twitter. It gives me anxiety. I don't post. I don't have any followers on there. I just go on and glance every once in a while, and it like it makes me anxious.
I just stopped. I just
Yeah,
while I was like, well, yeah, it was just too.
it's too
It's
much.
too hard. It's just
Yeah,
too hard.
it's
Like
the worst way to try and really like it, and that's what the world is. What the world is lacking in everything right now is pretty much its nuance, and that's about the worst way to go about nuance is
I
140
think that
characters.
with podcasts, I think you get a lot of it. I
Yeah,
think you get a lot of nuance, and if you follow a particular person, me or like Phil Maffetone, with his heart rate based training, and when you're trying to sell something, you kind of got to set hard and fast limits on it. Like
yeah,
just I was talking to someone about Phil Maffetone's heart rate training, so this is front of my mind. So he said 150 or 180 minus your age plus or minus 5, depending on, it's kind of the basis of his stuff. But then you talk to him, obviously, like there's such a greater uh like
yeah,
broader spectrum of like training and training zones
yeah.
and
He
training
understands
stimulus.
VT1. He understands different things other than heart rate. People think
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
just like
and
he's like,
totally. And
yeah,
but as the broad, like as the basis, he's going to sell that one thing that is going to work and at the start
yeah,
for like 90% of the people and for his audience. And then if you would like to know more, he's got a book, he's
yeah.
on a lot of podcasts, he's written a lot of articles. So you can go and then you can also hear some of his like
Lectures or speaking
naysayers, or
engagements.
the
Yeah,
people
yeah,
who are
yeah. Okay.
not
Yeah,
contradicting, but like
yeah,
arguing against some of his things.
yeah,
So you're googling Phil Maffetone heart rate training, and to be like, why
yeah,
Phil's training doesn't work.
yeah.
Okay, I should probably read that as well. um, but anything on social media is just going to be ultimately polarizing to, it's just where we're at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, no, it's funny when like you talk about, and especially with any of these things, like um, even talking about fasting, like there's a lot of nuance lost with fasting. Um, I started fasting when I was a teenager, like I did 21, I've done a 21 day water fast. I've done everything in between that. And I've trained for 2 years on one meal a day, eating in 1 hour. I've,
Oh, yep, so you
gone,
did that. Yep.
yeah, I've done the 48, eating every 48 hours. I've done it all. And there's a lot of nuance to fasting. There's ways that are more appropriate for people. There's ways that are less appropriate for people. And some people really don't need to do it. Like what are you trying to gain out of it? Do you live a healthy lifestyle? Do you get, a lot of activity, low level activity? Are you gardening or whatever it is, right? Like it's not really always a string that people need to pull, but it's like what's being broadcasted out there is like it's either you fast every day or you do, you know what I mean? Or whatever it is. It's like I've done the vegan, the carnivore, and it's when you get into those camps, people they really do themselves a disservice. But yeah, it's good to hear like you kind of talk on these things in a way where you're like, yeah, there's applicabilities here. What are some of the things that you're outside of this? What are some of the things that you're interested to see, or what are some of the stuff that you're, kind of excited about right now outside of diet? Whether it's training interventions, whether it's recovery interventions, maybe some stuff that you're currently investigating. What are some of the things out there that you've taken an interest to as of late?
uh what have I taken an interest in? Heat, definitely. I think there's a monitoring heat. So core. Did you had the core
Core
guys
sensor.
on, or you spoke
No,
to
I
someone
didn't.
with
No, but I have core
um
sensor. Yeah, I know
oh,
what
you've
you're
got
doing.
a,
Yeah,
yeah,
they're great.
yeah. So I don't fully understand the capabilities of those kind of devices. So this is one that kind of indirectly measures or estimates, I guess, your core temperature by measuring heat flux on skin surface.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's alongside with like running power, and these new devices, like the uh, the
Yeah.
NERS devices and the capabilities of our like just wrist-based devices,
Yeah.
sleep, like how can we package this up into like a really like digestible form that is
Yeah.
going to help the end user? Because at the moment, you know, you get this device, you have to have a, you know, completely external app. Maybe it works natively with your head unit or your wrist-based device, and still you got to try and like associate that with another third party app. So whether that's a running power device or your
Yeah.
heart rate or your Whoop or your Aura Ring, and Apple Fit watch, like, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like what do we need to care about some of the stuff? Like, do we
Yeah.
continuous glucose monitoring? Do we have, you know, when are we going to get these means of like getting the continuous lactate
Yeah.
monitoring? I think some guys are trying to do that, but it's expensive. You know, all the stuff's quite expensive,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'm super interested in trying to distill down some of those things that people can, because each of these companies on their own are trying to like make the best product for what they do, which is their job, right?
Yeah.
How can you use the core sensor to monitor your body temperature to best train, heat acclimate, like all of these things in
Yeah.
this finite, you know, in this like restrictive box? Like, yeah, but how does this associate to whatever other periodization training I'm doing? How does this associate with my lactate
Mm.
readings and my glucose readings? And
Yeah.
um, so I'm really trying to wrap my head around that. like
Yeah.
like what's next, you know? And yeah, it's tough because you got to talk to all these companies and you got to
Mm.
try and um, use all the devices, and then it changes, right? They're just the firmware updates and
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so and what yeah, and what does it matter?
Yeah. What does
So
it mean? What
and
is it?
what does it what does it mean? Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do you use your like core device?
One thing, well, one way I haven't used it, but I think will have potential is for traveling. And kind of understanding circadian rhythm because you can wear it like 24 hours, right? And understanding the changes in the diurnal rhythms to core temperature, right, is a good, it's a Zeitgeber essentially, right, for understanding where your body is thinking it's at. So understanding when you're kind of fully recovered from travel and jet lag and these things, I think that's a good application it'll have. I mean, obviously the main application that I use it for is heat adaptation, right? Like understanding how you respond from, you know, this session to this session from heat. How are you responding at the same in the temperature, external temperature in the air? Um,
Yeah.
how does your body change from here to here? Okay, well, let's test it again and let's intervene with something, right? Whether it's, you know, a couple's heat sessions, whether it's a, you know, a harder session, and see what does it look like here now? How much did that change? How fast are we responding? And looking at it like kind of like heart rate, right? Whether you're, you know, when you're playing around with heart rate, you kind of see like, oh, okay, there's this kind of lag here after this type of overreaching, and it takes them about this long to get back.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
same thing with core temperature. It's another, another thermal physiological, like you're just watching how fast it's responding, how well it's peaking, you know. And also when you're looking for stimulus, we know that, you know, we want to get the core temperature to certain 38.5 and above, if we're looking for those adaptations. So what does that mean when you're running in this type of external temperature? Like how long before you get in there? Anyways, there's a million ways to use it, but realistically, um, you know, and you can start to attach it to decoupling, right? Like for
Yeah.
stroke
But that's a
volume,
lot, right? Like
it's a
everything you've
lot. So
talked
that's what
about,
I mean. Like, don't,
it's like
yeah, you got to
and so
realistically,
now I'm overwhelmed and I don't want to buy the bloody thing, you know?
yes,
Like that
yes,
that
yeah,
happens. And then
yeah,
or like I'm like, well, I'm gonna have to pay you. I just have
yeah,
because I don't, right? And so now
yeah,
you like y- it's it becomes, whereas
yeah,
yeah, if you could distill that down and it's part of your Garmin or
yeah,
whatever, it And so
Yeah.
you can have it there, and then you can start to learn about it while it's there. And but at the moment, yeah, there's no, like, how many books do we have on how to run a marathon? Like, and it's all just, it's pace
Yeah.
based, and some are heart rate based, but
Yeah.
and we're only just there, right? Even now, people will still be like, oh, what heart rate do I need to do for the thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, well,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's been around for like a few decades now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then just try and throw like a temperature sensor and
Yeah.
like
It can
some
be
mirrors
overwhelming.
stuff. Yeah.
Like, that's the thing. I don't know. I'm sure you probably see this with athletes that you work with, is like, certain athletes you have to really just, you play that stuff in the background, but you kind of have to shield them from, certain things. And then, certain athletes, they really do want to understand it almost better than you. So you have to kind of do your
Yeah.
due diligence to,
Yeah. Yeah.
inform them.
Totally.
And like, and that's the hard part, is because, even though we're playing with some of these metrics, whether it's lactate, whether it's nears, whether it's heart rate, um, there's still a shit ton that we don't really understand. Like even with heart rate, like HRV, like we're talking about,
Oh
this
yeah.
DFA alpha 1 and stuff like this, right? Like, but even recovery, even going through some of the literature and textbooks, it's like, I have no idea what this even, like, it's taking me a year to wrap my head around this one word, what it means physiologically. Um, so I don't know.
Yeah, and then
What about you?
you're like in the real world, you're like,
Yeah.
does this matter? Like,
What do you keep an eye on?
what do you mean?
Like what are some of the things that you like, for example, what are your kind of go-tos that you use, whether it's with yourself or your athletes? Like maybe it's lactate, maybe it's heart rate, maybe it's nears
Yeah,
or
most
whatever.
recently it's been lactate.
Yeah.
And uh that's been super interesting. I had hectic last couple of years running like two jobs. I didn't really have the capacity to sit back and
Mm.
do some different things. But yeah, this year I've been training really religiously with lactate, and it's
Mhm.
it's been super interesting. Controlling intensity of my so I run marathons, ultra marathons. Yeah, and I had this big injury, and so coming back from that, and yeah, like controlling tempo threshold, like LT1, LT2, like kind of
Mhm.
lactate threshold 1 and 2, whatever you want to, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I
There's
know.
a thousand ways to do these kind of things, but yeah, and just yeah, really like looking at that has been super fun, and trying to associate that with, yeah, different performance markers,
Yeah.
and seeing how that could be used like on some athletes. And yeah, the profiles, it's so individual.
Yeah.
It's like, but you have to use this stuff yourself to really get that nuance,
Yeah.
to know, even like, when are you sampling, are you doing a 1K or a 1 mile, like all out effort, and then you're like having a break and you're walking over to your bag and taking the sample. It's like, well, that's
Mm,
going to be a lot different than me standing there and taking it right after you've done it.
yeah.
Are you taking it on face value? Are you doing duplicates? Like, you know,
Yeah.
when you start to realize, when you take ear, finger, like, um, all of the stuff is, yeah, fun.
Yeah. It's fun, and like what you're saying, there's really what rings true, and I hope people kind of take this away, is like, regardless of what you're using, understand the limitations of what you're using and understand how it responds to different variables. Lactate is one that I'm a big fan of lactate, but it's also one of the most finicky. Like you don't get this like continuous, we don't have a continuous lactate monitor. There's I think it's Precision that's coming out with the lactate ketone all in one. Anyways, it's going to be a ways away. Anyways, but just understanding, you know, what happens when I come in after a really hard session the day before. What does my lactate look like? Oh, it's a little bit high when I start. Or what happens, like you said, when I go to my bag and take it out, and like understanding all those things, right? And once you do, you realize like, oh shit, it doesn't really matter what I'm using to monitor. It's just getting really good with that thing. a lot of the times. And but lactate, if you do it right, I think it's an amazing tool. Like you come around to things when you start to play around with them, you realize, oh, they have usefulness. It's just being studious and paying attention to what you're doing. You know.
Yeah, and through that, you notice the trends that are unique to yourself.
Yeah.
If you like have the time and the capacity to do so, because yeah, being like, okay, I did my lactate test, I got my curve, and these are my numbers.
Yeah.
I need to be this is zone X, X, Y, and then trying to do that, and then getting the first reading, and it's 5 when it should be 3. Like, well, heart rate's in zone,
Yeah.
that hasn't rapidly increased. It's still under 160, and then like my pace, my power is all these numbers all look totally fine. I feel 4 out of 10,
Yeah.
like and effort wise. So why should I'll let's see what the next interval is rather than being like, all right, I'm
Yeah.
putting it down. Like I'm really gonna have to button off or
Yeah.
yeah. And so yeah, it's tough
That's good. So
physiology, I guess.
do you coach other do you coach a lot of ultra marathoners?
Yeah, that would probably be
Your main.
uh my main like client base at the
Yeah.
moment. So because I'm quite so active in the space, it's just I don't know if you've found this. It just follows
Yeah.
you. Like so,
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
was doing triathlon, I had a lot of triathletes, and then when I was in the high performance program, working with the junior team. Anyway, and now I'm like super present in ultra marathons, so doing that. So yeah, and I just so to help this whole thing that we talked about, I've been working on this reignite your running
Okay.
course. So I found it like uh obviously like you do coaching, you help people over different various sports and different like modalities and ways of helping. Someone might be just wanting like a one-off thing to try to get periodization. Some people want ongoing help. And it's all I found it quite hard to have them get the best product across the board of like, oh yes, but you could also do this, and then
Mhm.
also like working one-on-one with clients. They might leave after 6 months, like, yeah, I want Will, and I need help for this ultra marathon. We build up. But they don't actually leave with a lot. Like
Yeah.
I teach them a lot during the way, but they kind of offload the mental stress to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh look, mate, you're the genius. Like you're the guy who gets people ready to nail their ultra. Do it
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so but anyway, so what I've created is this reignite your running course. So it's like a 6 month course where for those that are interested, I work with a group through the 6 months to go, okay, this is my template. This is what I do to get you ready. And so like you're doing it.
Yeah.
So you're measuring your heart rate, right? Out there
Yeah.
in the field, and then you come back and you do it via the means that I do, and then you have the spreadsheet, right? And you go, and then you touch base with me again, okay? And
Yeah.
then you go, I did this, and you hear what the other people did, and it starts to create like you then are able to find that what I call like a runner's roadmap to your own success, as opposed to like either offloading it yourself or just doing it out of a book. Like you
Yeah.
start to, and so then because as you know, when you work with someone, you have all that knowledge behind you, and then you're individualizing their plan,
Yeah.
but they don't know what things you're
Yeah. Yeah.
leaving out, or why you have decided that their heart rate is, they run hot or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like, and so it's so that's what I've just released, doing the foundation round, and I'm going to keep kind of pushing that forward as my main like product from here forth.
That you want to know something? That's probably one of the most genius things I've ever heard. Like, I know people are like, "What do you mean it's a course?" But when you think about it, like, there's a huge drive right now for example, physiotherapy, something I'm very interested in over the years. And you have tons of these people in the kind of physical therapy, rehab, S&C kind of space that are mentoring people, right? They have these mentorship courses. And I'm like, I see the application here. But this to me, it's like, how has someone not thought about this before? Maybe someone has, maybe someone else has something similar, whether it's a workshop or, but I've never actually heard of a 6 month, because that is a thing where it's like when you're coaching someone, for example, you know how it is, you have an hour with that person. You don't
Yep.
want to sit there and explain to them why, like, you want to explain like somewhat why you're making the decision, your decision, but if you actually explain why you're making the decisions that you're making, it would take you 5 hours. You just don't have the time, right? You don't have the time to explain why you're making a decision. And sometimes that can lead to, you know, you have to do your best to kind of play that line where it's like, okay, explain it a little bit, but not too much. But if you don't do it well enough, they come back and be like, well, last time you said we were doing it this way for this, and why we're
Yeah.
doing it, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? And
Yeah.
then it's
Yeah.
like when you go through a course, that's just the most genius form of mentorship and coaching there really is, because the people that are going to sign up are going to be signing up because they want to learn how to do it themselves. Some people don't want to, some people don't
Yeah.
want to do
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
the
So
people
they
that are
can
going to
just
sign up,
get coaching. Yeah.
exactly. So I think that's brilliant, man. I think that's absolutely brilliant. That's such a smart idea. Um, yeah,
Um,
that's genius.
I tell you why no one's done it. It is too much work. It
It's a
is
lot of
too
work.
much upfront work.
Is it?
Like, because
Okay.
you can't just talk, you got to give them all the resources and
Yeah, yeah,
the assets that they can. Yeah.
yeah.
So but yeah, I'm excited because I left my
So
job at in tertiary education, like at the university, to
okay.
like focus on this for the next phase. So yeah.
So it's called the Ignite Running. Is that Ignite Your Running?
Reignite your running.
Reignite Your Running. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
and you're working on the foundations portions right now, right?
Yeah. So I've
Okay.
had I've so there's a wait list.
Okay.
So
All right.
yeah,
I'll make sure I'll
jump
put
on.
that in
I'll
the
reach out to you,
yeah.
and I can let you know when the next intake's coming in.
Okay. That's super cool. Um, well, what else out there do you want to let folks know about that you're doing, or where to find you and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I have my own podcast that I do with a guy I did my PhD with, Dr. Matt Miller. So that's the Performance Advantage podcast, just
Mhm.
wherever. So we're typically endurance-based sports, and we talk kind of practical training applications. Matt's
Mhm.
into mountain biking,
Okay.
so discuss a lot of that. Um, yeah, so similar stuff to what we've talked about today.
Yeah.
And yeah, just Instagram at Dr. Will O'Connor.
Yeah.
Those are the main ones. That's where I keep, you know, everything
Yeah.
going, I
Okay.
guess. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave the links to the show notes and for that stuff, folks. So I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. And thanks to Will for coming on. And we'll catch you later.